The requirement for Haslar and a hospital as such was realised around about 1740. Activities of the Royal Navy at that time were basically globally. In the Atlantic, the Pacific, a lot of exploration was also going on around the southern hemispheres, Australia, New Zealand, James Cook, the Endeavour. And of course many of them weren't coming back because scurvy was taking its toll, battle was taking its toll, illnesses were rife on board ship because of the conditions. There were more people killed in battle from the wooden slivers of the oak warships being hit by cannonballs than there was by people actually being shot and everything else. And yet there was nobody to look after them. And one of the reasons that actually sort of caused the beginning to Haslar was the Lord of the Admiralty, Lord Montague, actually petitioning King George II because he had actually witnessed sailors being brought to Gosport and put in horse and carts and dragged to the Fortune Hospital that was run by Mr. Nathaniel Jackson, who was charging so much per head. And yet they found there were more than one or two patients in beds, some dying and some actually succeeding. But it was after the petition that it was put into rule that there would be naval hospitals in England. They put a budget for £39,000 in those days. Haslar was commenced around 1740, 1742, and the first block to open was the front facade of Haslar in 1753, October the 12th, it is believed. But there is no real date because the story is that sailors of the fleet had got the message of what was going on at Haslar, and it was going to become a hospital for sick and injured seamen. And the builders at the time had a whole series of builders' huts, like wimpy huts, in the grounds of where the facade was being built. And the sailors were beginning to occupy the huts, which really annoyed the builders. And there's many a letter in the Maritime Museum at Greenwich, which actually makes you chuckle when you start to read it. Such was the pressure being placed on the Admiralty over the sick and injured occupying the huts that they basically give a decree, open what has been built of Haslar, and it happened in October of 1753. From opening and right up to sort of the late 19th century, the capacity of Haslar waxed and waned according to the various battles that were going on. The injured were taken from the Battle of Waterloo, the Crimean Wars, the Boer Wars, the African Wars, as well as the Navy of the day, the Army of the day as well. So numbers would increase to over 2,000 patients in 114 wards, which is immense. The injured were deposited by the various ships coming into harbour at the jetty completely opposite Haslar that ran down to the port itself. And in the first instance, the dead and dying were actually brought on handcarts, which were pulled by the staff up to the arcade. It was realised that there was more and more people coming, and in 1870 they built a hospital tramway from the jetty to the arcade, and there were 3 trams that were built to carry patients 4 at a time from the jetty up into the arcade, and then the empty one would go, it's like a little railway, points all the way down. And at that time, they actually built a 14-inch gauge railway inside the tram track, which went off to Fort Blockhouse. And not only from Fort Blockhouse, along the front of the hospital, and came in front of Zymotics, built in 1890, to offload infectious patients. And then back again. But eventually that little railway ran all the way to Fort Gilkicker and round to Stokes Bay. Zymotics is a Victorian phrase for infectious disease. Zymotics was a new venture for Haslar, and actually it became the second part of the hospital, separate from Haslar Hospital main itself, because it had a mighty wall around it, and you could only enter through a special gate which was manned so that it didn't spread disease. The Zymotics building itself was an open plan, something that was new for the Victorian era, where there was an open front so the patients could sit and take fresh air of the sea in a sort of help to cure them. Haslar, in a way, has always been at the cutting edge of care for patients right back into the 18th century, because of the doctors and physicians of the day, 18th century, 19th century, 20th and onwards, were always of the best education, the best medical schools, and then joining the Navy became very experienced in dealing with, gunshot wounds, cannon fire, ships, how they affect the crews and the lot, both sort of surgically and medically. James Lind is now referred to as the father of nautical medicine. He came as the second physician in charge. He was meant to be the first physician, but he was so busy with his trials for a treatment for scurvy that then 5 years later, in 1758, he actually came here. He was the first person to write a set of rules for how the hospital should be run, and included all the patients. And one of them was in force right up to the closure of Haslar: no smoking. But he was a very, very professional in his approach, and he, even with TB, felt that by building huts in the grounds of Haslar, it would be treating patients in the open air, and it actually started to cure them. But he also had another rule. Haslar's 3 floors high, and he actually pulled about the fact that the sick and the dying were nursed on the upper floors of the hospital. If they improved, they came down 2nd floor and ground floor, by which that time they could then go for a walk and a stroll in the grounds of the hospital. John Richardson came to Haslar in 1838 as the inspector of hospitals and fleets, and he had taken up an interest in fish and wildlife and exploring. And he became really the medical branch's most famous explorer of all. It would be too much to go into his exploring life, but he sailed twice with Admiral Franklin in search of the Great Northwest Passage and returned both times. He did not go on the 3rd journey, where Franklin and his crew were lost. But he then became involved very much with Lady Jane Franklin, who asked him if he would undertake to explore the Great Northwest Passage area to find her husband. Richardson became famous because he actually knew his surgeon staff, and they themselves in a way were explorers. So he used to call them to his house, had a large dining room, and they would actually discuss the way forward. And he sent for people like Huxley, who went on Rattlesnake to the Pacific, and he became Darwin's bulldog. He left the Navy. But there were many others who went on ships around the world exploring, and of course they would bring all the specimens back. which formed the main part of the sadly lost museum. Florence Nightingale wrote to Richardson. It was the time of the Crimean War. There were no army hospitals in England. And how do you actually set up a hospital, which was her task here in England itself? And she wanted to know how it was equipped, how it was funded, and such like. And she corresponded in such a way that they actually met here in House 12 and discussed the way forward. And there's a letter that now resides in the Army Museum that Florence Nightingale regarded Haslar as a shining star in nursing and patient care. But that goes to Queen Victoria as well. She visited Haslar on numerous occasions. In fact, she was holidaying in Osborne House most summers, and she would actually telegraph the commanding officer with only an hour's notice, I'm on my way. And she used to visit Haslar, she'd visit all the patients, she would bring medals with her or be presented with the medals and present them to the patients in their beds. And there's one lovely story about Queen Victoria. She came to give Egyptian medals, and it was such a day, it was busy, and she was going through the ward, and she went to pin the medal on one young lad who'd been badly injured, and he tried to get out of bed to stand before his queen, and she walked up to him, and this is all evidential, and she put her finger on his forehead and pushed him back down onto his pillow. But in her obituary that was written as she died at Osborne House, Haslar is the finest of institutions that was ever founded. And that's what, in a way, we're proud of. Haslar at the time of the late 19th century and 20th century was continually busy. The latter part, 1897, with the African wars going on, leading into the Boer War. Benin, the campaigns that were going on down there, was bringing the sick and injured back here to Haslar. In fact, that campaign saw the first nursing sister of the Queen Alexandra's Royal Naval Nursing Service serving with the army in Africa, and the return of the sick and injured, which was a great thing was made of it. The Duke of York, he came to Haslar to basically greet the returning injured and to issue medals to those, and one of them was the senior nursing sister. And then we go into the early 20th century with the build up to the First World War, and Haslar was taking patients here from the war. There was Portuguese, there were French, there was American, and there were English, all here being cared for throughout the whole of the First World War. Haslar was busy during World War II. Despite the various battles that were going on, Dunkirk, the evacuation of Dunkirk, but the biggest one was D-Day. And preparation for D-Day started at least a year, 18 months beforehand. Even the Americans became involved in this with Brigadier Elliot Cutler, who was working with Haslar in the collection of nursing staff and planning for caring for the patients. And there were some 1,700 casualties that came in through Haslar's doors from the 7th of July until mid-August, and were cared for in 2 operating theatres in the undercroft of Haslar, the cellars, and they still exist to this day, the 2 theatres themselves. Haslar was never really struck. In fact, it was used as a direction pointy with the water tower being where it was. The Luftwaffe were coming across the Isle of Wight, and they then proceeded over Haslar to the dockyard, especially in August of 1940, which was one of the worst bombing raids. And the only evidence we have of any attack on Haslar was the loss of the museum between the two of the blocks, when they believed really it was an accident. Somebody had just dropped a bomb. But it unfortunately destroyed the Haslar Museum, which had been here since 1837 and lost in 1941 and only replaced with a small museum afterwards. And Haslar had the Red Cross in the centre of the quadrangle as well, and should really have informed them that this was a hospital. I think it could have been an accident. One of the notable changes for Haslar after the Second World War was the formation of the National Health Service. And the Navy actually agreed to 84 beds being provided for the care of NHS patients within the Portsmouth Command, so to speak. And as the 1940s and into the 50s, this gradually increased. And naval families were brought into Haslar as well at that point. Children for tonsillectomies, the wives for various required operations of naval personnel, and that increased even more into the 60s and the 70s, which then brought about the requirement to increase the surgical provision within Haslar. And at that point, it was decided that a crosslink building would be built, much to the upset, I will say, of a lot of the staff here, because it was never considered to be built in a Georgian standard. Because there was Crown immunity for planning, the MOD built what they thought should be built. And so we had this crosslink building, no more in position. But I will say that it had an A&E department, it had 5 operating theatres, it had an X-ray department, eventually with MRIs, there was clinical support, increased clinic within the area, so taking more patients. I came to Haslar in 1964 and my training was here for a period of 6 weeks, and then plenty of exams, and it then went on for a further training of 3 months, and then I joined the Royal Naval Medical Branch, which I was to serve 32 years. There was over 360 civilian staff, and I would say at times a good 1,000 service medical branch personnel. Increased by need. If it was expanding because of, shall we say, the Falklands campaign, then there were more people brought in. And other campaigns, people went away to serve abroad in Afghanistan and Iraq and such places. It was in the mid-1970s when, I started to ask questions about staircases and, the cellars, which are the creepiest, and the vast cellars which are underneath all of these buildings, which in themselves actually contain a story of what went on down there. I used to actually run lunchtime tours, winter and summer, of the cellars for the staff. And my little book was absolutely full on a monthly basis when I was doing this. And you'd have 20, 30 members of staff who wished to come round. And I remember to this day, one day I had a whole group of nurses, and what power there was in the cellars failed, instant darkness. And it took weeks for my eardrums to actually come back to normal from the screams and everything else. But that's when the fascination all began. And I just wanted to know more. And then there was 2 colleagues of mine who had likewise interest. And we came together and Haslar Heritage Group was formed and grew in numbers up to today. I can actually feel here today that whilst my time's here, I could tell tales which will have you in tears, and did me many occasions. But they're outweighed by the laughter and how we worked and overcame those dark days with the odd prank, joke and things like that, which had to be done to raise and lift your sort of thoughts. And no, Haslar is magic. The name Haslar, to any person who worked here, would bring memories, both dark, sad, but also a smile to their face. Because we all have our own personal, individual history of Haslar, which if you put everybody together, their thoughts and their history would actually make an encyclopedia. We attained an excellence in our education, many of us coming straight from school, college, in our teens, and going through our training, our qualification, everybody. That's the medical staff, the nursing staff, the surgical staff, all the individual technical specialities. We all provided an excellence of service from our training and our years unexperienced here in Haslar. Fun, laughter, tears, and we all have very fond memories. And the best way really is to say to those people who are now residents here is, we hand the watch to you.